Some time ago, I was traveling in Nevada, and I had occasion to meet with a former deputy sheriff in Nye County. And he had just changed jobs from the police force. He had moved to become the director of one of the largest firearms training academies in the country, perhaps in the world. And I was just speaking to him casually, and I asked him, well, why did you move? And he told me this story. So like most law enforcement people, he had started off in the police because he wanted to make a difference. He actually wanted to help people. And one day, a young nurse came to his office, and she wanted his help because she was afraid for her life. She had just run away from an abusive boyfriend, and the boyfriend had sworn that if she ever left him, he would kill her. So she went to an attorney, and she got a restraining order against him. But here she was in his office asking for help. And Wes said to her, you know, there's nothing I can do professionally. You've been to the attorney, you've got the restraining order, he hasn't done anything yet. But I would advise you to go out and buy a gun, and also to train to learn how to use it. And he gave her a list of shooting schools. She ignored his advice, and she actually went back to the hospital where she worked, and she asked the advice of a couple of doctors that she trusted. And the doctors both told her the same thing. They agreed she should not buy a gun because she would probably hurt herself or somebody else, and they counseled her to buy a whistle. Exactly a week later, the boyfriend caught up with the nurse in the parking lot of the hospital where she turned up for her morning shift. He stabbed her 27 times while she was desperately blowing the whistle. We know she blew the whistle because they heard it in the hospital. After the funeral, the parents came to Wes and they asked him, why did you fail our daughter when she came to you specifically for help? And Wes said to me that he often thought about that nurse and whether there was anything he could have done to have saved her life. And he decided that she was killed because of all the misinformation about firearms, because firearms had such a bad reputation, and that he could do better by going out into the world and helping to educate people about firearms, how to use them, when to use them, and what are the legal consequences of using lethal force. I started going to Nevada and taking regular courses at the institution where he was teaching it and he was running it too. And I loved those courses, and I learned such a lot. I learned so much that I wanted to share what I had learned. So I started taking my clients. I started asking them if they want to come. And one time I took a serial tech entrepreneur, the kind of person that incubates these startups and then sells them, helps sell them to larger companies. And it was the last day of a 4-day defensive handgun course. And the morning had been pretty intense because we've been in these shoot houses where cardboard pop-ups suddenly appear, and they could be the bad guys or the good guys, and they could be having a firearm in their hand, or it could be a hostage, or it could be just an innocent article. And the instructors are concealed, and they enjoy themselves, and they're often shouting obscenities and banging on the doors just to increase the realism. Anyway, it was lunchtime, and I'll call my client Stephen, and I saw Stephen talking to Wes very intently. But what surprised me was that this hard-bitten entrepreneur appeared to be crying. So curious, I wandered over and I heard him saying to Wes, when I was invited to attend this course, I thought it was all going to be about guns and shooting. But it's not. I suddenly realized this morning, it's all about family. It's all about protecting the people I love. And because he was such a hot father, he'd felt this very deeply, and these tears were welling up in his eyes. The right to self-defense, to the means of defending oneself and the people we love, is a basic natural right, and gun control laws interfere with that right. People often do bad things, including hurting others, and sometimes the only way to stop them is to use lethal force. So, to the person who doesn't value self-defense, or who wants to ban firearms, or who wants to enact gun control laws that make it harder for people to defend themselves, I ask one simple question, and that is, what moral authority do you claim to tell others not to defend themselves against aggression? The philosopher George Santayana said, "Those of us who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So I want to remind you that modern gun control laws actually had their origin in racist legislation designed to prohibit slaves and black freedmen from owning guns. This was done not just to deny blacks the political power of arms, but also to prevent them from aspiring to the dignity of free men. What did the Founding Fathers mean by the dignity of free men? They meant that the colonists were willing and able to make life or death decisions and take the full consequences of their actions, and only by doing so would they earn the right to govern themselves. So it should be no surprise to learn that the Ku Klux Klan began as a gun control organization. Before the Civil War, blacks were never allowed to own guns, so after the Civil War, there was constant pressure from these racists to keep guns out of the hands of African Americans because of the risk that they would rise up and revolt. And these racists had a point. In 1942, Adolf Hitler said, "The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to permit the conquered Eastern peoples to have arms. History teaches that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their own downfall by doing so." I realize that not every firearm regulation leads inexorably to genocide, but broad restrictions on the ownership of private arms only leads to one conclusion, and that is a vast increase in the power of politicians. But it is political tyranny that has taken more lives over the last century than ever have abusive private gun owners. Unfortunately, gun control advocates offer no solution to the problem of political tyranny. It's almost as if they think the problem will disappear as long as they believe that government is our friend. I've been told that this view is very un-American, but the distrust of governments grabbing guns has a long and honourable history. The initial conflicts at Lexington and Concord were all about the British regiments marching out in order to confiscate the colonists' arms stores. The British assumed that seizing these weapons would actually quell the resistance to the expansion of their power.
Time's up. It was 9 minutes.
George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, later declared that the British decided that to disarm the people was the best and most effective way to enslave them. If the colonists reasoned like some contemporary gun control advocates, they would have interpreted the British troops' attempt to seize their guns as proof of how much the British cared for them. On gun control, we have to judge politicians by their records, not by empty promises that can never be enforced after citizens have been disarmed. Gun control laws ultimately rest on the trustworthiness of the political ruling class. The only way that firearms could be less vital to defending freedom now than in the past is if politicians were no longer dangerous. But there is no trigger guard on political ambition. Has anyone noticed today that illiberal democracy is on the march around the world?
I certainly concur with the distinguished gentleman when he says about the importance of defending oneself and one's family. That is not an issue on the table here tonight. I would like to do a brief survey of Anglo-American history to add some perspective. Going back to Saxon England, there was not a standing army. It was called the levy. That is, every freeman was expected to contribute a certain term of service for the public defense. Part of England was settled by the Danes. It was called the Danelaw, and of course the Vikings had the same expectation. Every free man was expected to not only own weapons, but to be proficient with weapons. Now, the Norman conquest changed all that. The Normans were a hostile takeover, and the barons saw the English as a threat, just as my colleague here suggested. So, therefore, began the subjugation of the English people. And the peasants, the commoners, are reduced to serfdom. To have armed peasants was considered dangerous to the ruling class. Now, each baron had his knights, and the knights got restless, bored. Guess what they did for sport? Kill peasants. So one reason that the Pope, who objected to them killing the peasants, called the First Crusade was, guess what? Get them out of there, give them something to do, or they get killed off perhaps. As they came back somewhat chastened and humbled, it wasn't quite as bad. Two things turned the tide. One was the English longbow. During the 100 Years' War, the longbow was decisive in winning two great victories for the English side. Two of the three great battles. The second was the development of firearms, gunpowder, and of course the Black Death was a great leveler. But it took centuries for the English commoner to regain some of his rights. Time went by and the colonists came to America. The American colonists were left to fend for themselves. No British regulars, no standing army. They had to band together for defense against the Indians, and of course they were very proficient with muskets, rifles, and so forth. In the colonies, as in Saxon times, defense was based on the levy, on the militia, called from the plow to defend the community, the colony, and so forth. That was the background behind Lexington and Concord. The colonists were doing what they were accustomed to doing. We're here for self-defense. Rarely in the 100 years preceding the Revolution did you see British troops on American soil, because they were just across the big pond. They were in Canada, of course, to rescue Canada from the French, but rarely in the American colonies. So now you had the Quartering Act and various other acts by the Parliament, which infuriated the colonists. They're not accustomed to having regulars quartered there where they live. And the army that opposed them eventually was, again, militia, called up. In the course of American history, how much time do I have there?
You're in 4 minutes.
In the course of American history, the whole idea of individualism, of personal freedom, was cherished. O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. That was really at the heart of what America was all about. And no one would dream of suggesting, well, you can't have firearms. I mean, this was what the nation was based on. Washington was opposed to a standing army. Not until quite a bit later did that come into being. The War of 1812, there was a token army. By the time the Mexican War came around, there was a small army under General Winfield Scott. But it was not until the War for Southern Independence that you suddenly had a transition from volunteers paid a bounty to eventually standing armies. Nevertheless, the tradition of rugged individualism of independence was strong here in America. And the government was loath to take away personal freedoms. That went on for some time. Now, my colleague talked about the slaves, the free slaves. We're not talking about that now. We're talking about the rest of society. What was it that caused the federal government to promulgate restrictions on gun ownership? Anyone know? Well, it was the mob, the mafia. What happened was there was at that time no restriction to civilians owning machine guns. So these guys would go in their lorries and their cars down the road and machine gun people. And suddenly here's a threat to the general welfare. And the government had to reluctantly take steps to restrict ownership of firearms. You guys can't have machine guns go around blasting people. Now, it was done with trepidation. We don't want to restrict freedoms, but we're forced to do it by circumstances. We have some cherished rights as Americans here. One is the right of habeas corpus, First Amendment freedoms. Are those freedoms totally without limit? And of course not. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, you can't sit in a crowded theater and shout, "Fire!" You can't do that. You can't have a religious group that says, our mission is to steal from the banks and kill all the rich. You can't do that in the name of First Amendment freedoms. Any of our freedoms have common sense limitations. And as far as gun ownership, that's a cherished American right. Tens of millions of Americans own guns. No one in their right mind would try to take that right away. The issue is not taking the right away, it is giving it its proper scope. So that's the issue here. What I'm trying to point out here is that in America, the trend toward regulation of firearm ownership and use was brought about by reluctant necessity, not by an overweening desire to control the peasantry. And so we come down now to the present. And here in California, for example, you can own an assault rifle, but not a fully automatic assault rifle. You can own an AR-15, but not fully automatic. But you have some basic common sense restrictions that are brought about by necessity. Thank you.
So thank you, Dave. I actually only heard one substantive point about in defense of gun control laws, and that was that they were brought in order to restrict Tommy guns. And I mean to machine guns, and I think that's probably in reference to prohibition in the 1920s. And in January 1920, they brought in prohibition against alcohol, and it was brought in because of the temperance movement, and all the politicians were in favor of it. And guess what? It was an absolute disaster. Alcohol usage actually rose from before Prohibition times. People who were manufacturing it continued to manufacture alcohol. People used it. The police were totally ineffective at controlling the production, sale, consumption of alcohol. But what happened was you got people like Al Capone who rose up, tried to get a monopoly of importing alcohol into the cities. There was violence that was far worse than violence that was traditionally known, and that, of course, is exactly what would happen if anyone tried to, take people's guns away, or there was, really strict restrictions on guns, or they wanted to, invade people's houses to go and search for guns. You would have exactly the same thing. You would have new Al Capones rising up and trying to control the importation of illegal weapons, and it would be a terrible situation. So most of my presentation had to do with, the right to self-defense. And I've had a lot of people over the years say, but this is America, this is America. How can you keep talking like this about the need for guns? And so I do want to finish just briefly what I was saying. I started off by saying, has anyone realized that we're seeing illiberal democracy spread around the world today? That we have the European Union almost in a state of paralysis, perhaps disintegration, and we've seen right-wing parties in the European Union inching their way, but very steadily inching their way towards power. No one with a sense of history can feel that liberal rights are secure in Poland, in Austria, in Hungary. Italy's major banks are right at the brink of becoming bankrupt. That could easily push the right-wing parties into power in Italy. Even in England, in Britain, we have a resurgence of anti-Semitism. In France, there's a growing challenge from Marine Le Pen, the right-wing kind of Nazi group. And even in Germany, Angela Merkel just recently defended the prosecution of a comedian. Why? Because he made fun of the Turkish Prime Minister. Turkey itself, right on the borders of the European Union. Everybody's read about what's happening there with the judges and journalists being arrested just on hearsay because of that coup. And finally, here in the United States, politics will never ever be the same after Trump, a presidential nominee that openly is in favor of torture and deporting millions of men, women, and children. So does anybody think it might not happen here? Most Americans don't trust their government, or more properly, they don't trust the people who hold the highest positions in government. And that feeling existed long before Edward Snowden showed how the US government was actually spying on its own citizens and friends around the world. Twitter, Google, Facebook, and Tumblr have all erected firewalls against NSA spying, just as pro-gun citizens they arm themselves. Why? Against the possibility that the government will take away their rights one by one until we end up in a police state where the government can do whatever it wants because the citizenry has been disarmed and they have no ability to resist. The Constitution does guarantee rights, but it doesn't enforce anything. Guns do. The final and ultimate, the only effective protection that American citizens have for their rights of freedom of speech, of press, religion, and others are their guns. It may not be the best, but it is the most effective. In my opinion, gun control advocates were actually responsible for disarming the people in the Florida nightclub. Why? Because I know Florida quite well. It's a very easy place to get a concealed weapons permit. It's actually the easiest place in the world. You can actually, even from San Francisco, you can write in filling in a little form, send it. They'll send you a concealed weapons permit that would work in Florida, not in California. Very easy place, and lots of people carry concealed weapons. However, the gun control advocates made sure there was one place not just one, there was at least one place where they couldn't carry guns, and that was in places which sell alcohol which can be consumed on the premises. What does that do? It waves a big flag and says, if you want a place which is concentrated, where there's going to be lots of people and they're all going to be defenseless, this is it. And that's what happens. The people who want to kill lots of people, they don't go to the United States bullion depository at Fort Knox and whip out an assault rifle. It doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? They're not afraid of dying. They actually want to die, but they want to die after they've killed lots of other people. The more the merrier. And they can't do that in a police station. But they can do that in a place where there are lots of helpless people, like schools and churches and shopping malls. Gun control laws don't deter criminals. Gun ownership does. Gun ownership has doubled in the 20th century. Murder rate has decreased. The places with the strongest gun control laws, you all know them, Washington, D.C., New York City, they have some of the highest rates of murders. The rate of gun ownership is much higher among whites than it is blacks, but the murder rates are much higher among blacks than whites. Britain is also often used as an example, very tight gun controls, very low crime. But you look back for 200 years and you see that Britain has always had lower rates of murders. And for most of that time, gun control was not stricter in Britain than it was in the United States. In 1950, anybody could go in London, purchase a shotgun, no questions asked. But in New York at the same time, they had the Sullivan Law. They had very strict gun control laws in New York. However, the murder rates were much, much higher, not just for guns, but for other weapons too. Switzerland and Germany. Switzerland has 3 times the rate of gun ownership than Germany does, but it has much lower crime rates. Other countries, Israel, New Zealand, Finland, again, very high rates of gun ownership, very low rates of crime. Something the gun control advocates never want to talk about, defensive uses of gun control. Gary Kleck, who's a Florida criminologist, has estimated, the figures have been challenged, and then he comes up with the same figures again, and when he documents it very extensively, over 750,000 defensive uses of a gun each year. That means it's not fired. Somebody points a gun, and the other person turns around and gets away as fast as they can. You know, a little old lady wakes up at night, pulls the gun out. Is that it? Okay.
1 minute.
You know, the police can't be there all the time. Even Senator Dianne Feinstein in the 1970s, she applied for and got and still carries a concealed weapon. Initially it was because there was an attempt on her life in the 1970s. Yeah, everybody talks about 30,000 murders or gun murders a year. What they forget to say is that 20,000 of those are suicides. Actually, there's very few gun murders. I mean, relatively few gun murders. Poisoning, car accidents, all account for more. Okay.
Well, now I'd like to clarify for a minute here. The distinguished gentleman is speaking of various other countries. We're talking about the United States tonight, not these other countries. And he really pointed out something very significant. A huge issue is the populace, the culture, the education, the whole background. Switzerland is not a violent country, but they are very skilled at self-defense with firearms and so forth. The English traditionally would have very low rates of violent crime, but now you have a huge population from some other countries who are very violent, and that has transformed England into some areas which are very dangerous places. That is one huge cause of the development of gun control in America, because when you had your Anglo-Saxon stock that settled this country, there was no need for it. But you had first the Irish. I'm half Irish, so I can say that, right? First you had the Irish that's developed their criminal activities. You had the Italians came and developed the mafia and so forth. You had other groups. Now you have some from Arab countries, and so that has changed the landscape. My colleague would like to go back to the time of Jeffersonian America, where his ideal was a nation of small freehold farmers, self-contained, self-controlled, responsible, educated, and so forth. That is not the case today. Times have changed. Now we have a very dangerous world around us. A young woman was taking a walk with her family down near Fisherman's Wharf, and some guy that was in because of the sanctuary law here decided to shoot her. Insanity, absolute insanity. It's a dangerous place. No one tonight is suggesting to take away everyone's firearms. No one is suggesting that they're not needed for self-defense. It's not the issue in the slightest here tonight. I'm not proposing that tonight. But allow me to talk about the slippery slope argument, which my distinguished opponent has referred to. The Second Amendment rights, if the government starts to restrict any of these, it'll go all the way till you have nothing. Well, that's preposterous on its face. for a number of reasons. As precious as are the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution are, all of them are subject to certain common sense limits. Because we say you cannot scream fire in a crowded theater doesn't mean you take away the First Amendment. Because you say you can't well, a civilian cannot own a Sidewinder Gatling gun which spews out 3,000 rounds a minute, doesn't mean no one can own a handgun or a rifle or an assault rifle. For that matter, I used to practice with assault rifles. I could get off 5 shots a second, semi-automatic, pulling the trigger each time. And it's not bad, really. So do you need more than that for self-defense? Really, honestly? So this conspiracy theory, whole idea of slippery slope is bogus. Totally bogus. No one up there in their right mind wants to do what they claim that they're trying to do. Now, one thing about the Second Amendment. It has been suggested that it is for the citizens to protect themselves from the government. Well, that's misstating. It's a revisionist history of America. That is not how it started. I even saw someone have the nerve to add to what George Washington said about it. He said, yes, that our citizens need to have firearms. Absolutely. But they added a piece where he said to protect against the government. That's absolute nonsense. That wasn't even thought of back then at that time. So the issue of the Second Amendment began where? Because of the citizen army, the militia. The need for a well-regulated militia, therefore the right shall not be infringed. So that was against foreign enemies, against Indians and so forth like that. So again, the revisionist history tries to make it look different. Now let's take another example that has been brought up about soft targets. Well, so the idea is that these sickos seek out shopping malls and so forth, and so now we're going to go where no one has guns. Well, as far as Florida, there was an armed guard there. But before I get into that, think about something. When you have alcohol and partying, emotions tend to run rampant. Fights break out. Ever since the times of the Wild West in the 1870s, you had to leave your firearms outside the bar. That's nothing new. It's plain old common sense. You might have fisticuffs, but not shootouts in the bar. And so there's nothing conspiracy about that. It's just plain old common sense again. But there was an armed guard there. He was a veteran, and guess what he did? He fled. Shame on him. Gun, and he fled. The actual statistics show that out of 33 mass public shootings in the past several years, since 2009 and 2014, 18 occurred in areas where guns were not banned or had armed security, about half, right? So the issue they found is not so much soft targets, unless you're a terrorist. The issue is having a personal grudge. Usually, workplace, right? I'm going to take out the people that fired me. School, I'm going to take out the ones that bullied me. I'm going to take out this teacher that ridiculed me. Personal grudges are behind most of these mass shootings. That and violent video games. You want to ban something? Ban the violent video games. I had the unpleasant experience of having a roommate next door who loved violent video games. I tried to get to sleep as I heard this on over and over. Let the bodies hit the ground. Let the bodies hit the ground. And he loved it. He thrived on it. At some point, they'll translate into real life. Ban those insane games. That's what you want to ban. Stuff like that. Another thing that often is pointed out, if shooters want to get access to a gun, even with strict gun laws in place, they can. Oh, guess what? You can buy, when I was in college, I was assembling a caliber 50 Browning air-cooled machine gun. I had everything but the lower receiver. And then I left out of state, so the project dropped just as the ATF was starting to focus on me. Fortunately for me, right? But you could buy the lower receiver, 80% done, no number stamped on it, finish it yourself, and have an unregistered weapon. So yes, you can get guns that way, or get them through the black market and so forth. So therefore, the logic is that since they'll get guns from somewhere, there's no point in having laws at all. Well, imagine that. Since people break the speed laws, instead of going 65, they go 80 on these freeways, why have laws? Right? Come on, give me a break. Use some common sense here. There'll always be scofflaws, always be those that try to get around it, but nevertheless, the laws do make a difference. In fact, in Canada, the fellow could not have got away with it because of their much stricter laws there against getting these kind of weapons there, and the registration and the background checks that are more strenuous than ours are here. So I think let's get some of these things cleared up, clarification here. Prohibition, you say. That didn't stop alcohol. And gun control won't stop guns. Well, of course not. But it's regulation. It's common sense regulation that we're talking about here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave and Malcolm, for your eloquent advocacies. Now we have 10 minutes for questions. And here are the guidelines for questions. Don't ask a question until you have this microphone in your hand. And try to have a pointed question. No speeches. And then in terms of answering the questions, each speaker will get a chance to answer the question, but you can direct your question to one of the speakers. Okay, who would like to ask a question? Yes?
Yes. So how, I don't need a microphone? I can
No,
hear me.
just
Great.
repeat the
Okay,
question.
this is for Malcolm. And Malcolm, I just want to ask you if the story went another way with the lady, the anecdote that you started with, that the lady who was a nurse, and your thought is that she should walk around the hospital with a gun. And why do you think that if she had a gun, her husband, who I assume might be stronger than her with a knife, wouldn't be able to have killed her anyway? And why shouldn't she have been told by all those nice people to go into a shelter where they protect women who have an abusive somebody after them? So I think isn't it possible that that same issue, without her having a gun, could have had other ways to have solved her problem?
Okay, let me see if I get the question right. Correct me if I left something out. And the question basically is, rather than this woman who Malcolm described in his opening statement using a gun for protection, aren't there other non-gun ways for her to protect herself? Is that basically it?
And why do we assume that the gun would have kept her from that unfortunate end?
And why do we assume that the gun would have kept her from that unfortunate end, since we don't have a controlled experiment here? Is that it?
Sure. I'll take that.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, clearly there are always other ways of defending yourself. The question is, which is the most effective? Obviously, the whistle was...
It's a more pleasant society with everybody walking around with guns ready to shoot people, or with people thinking of other ways to make themselves safe.
So, obviously, the whistle was one solution, but it wasn't an effective solution.
No, I would suggest.
You know, a firearm would be recommended for the following reasons. A firearm is a great equalizer. You put a 300-pound guy up against a 110-pound woman, and without the gun, we know who's going to prevail. But the gun equalizes. Somebody who, you know, you talk about guns as if, you know, the gun's firing off. Somebody who is trained to use a weapon would know exactly what to do in that kind of situation. Somebody approaches her in a parking lot. Stop! Don't come any closer!
Oh my God.
I'm not pointing the gun at them, I'm pointing them down, even if my finger presses the trigger. Right, it's safe. Don't come any closer! Stop or I'll shoot! even if it was a foreigner, somebody who didn't even understand the language, they would get the gist of it. They would get the gist of it. And by, making that kind of declamation, they'd probably draw attention, other people would come. The chances are she would have been alive. We're not talking about people going around with open carry, we're talking about concealed carry. You would be very surprised, even in California, how many doctors, especially in emergency rooms, and how many people who go out, the paramedics and so forth, actually carry concealed weapons. Lots of them do. It doesn't mean they're showing them all the time. It just means they're holstered, they're safe, they're concealed, and they can be brought out if they're actually needed.
Now may I respond?
Where do they keep it in their home, though? Where do you keep it in your home?
Well, can I respond to both of those? First of all, in the crazy days of my youth, I was trained to be a mercenary, and I trained in combat shooting. Yes, and the problem is this. If you have a gun, you can actually be in more danger unless you know very well how to use it at a split second and you are actually going to use it. Now, our nurse would probably carry it in her purse, not in a holster. You imagine going around the hospital floor with a holstered gun? What's going on here? And therefore, do you think the guy is stupid? He sees her carrying a, he's going to come and confront her. I'm here. Okay. No, of course not. Stealth. So you wait till the person is going to the car, opening the door. You're one car over. You get her from behind. She cannot get to her gun. It will not do her a bit of good. So you have to be able to have it immediately accessible at a fraction of a second, deploy it with accuracy.
And where's the hypodermic needle and his
One question at a time, please.
Secondly, you have to have the right caliber. A caliber 32, such as some ladies often carry, will not stop an angry man. A 38 will not, unless you get them right here. You have to have a 45. That knocks them down. So unless you're going to carry a 45 with a 6-inch barrel, then and have it at the ready, then that's a whole different issue. So unless you actually are skilled as a combat shooter and are going to use it, you're often better not to have one around. As far as having it in the home, you don't want to have it in the closet downstairs because they might find it and use it against you. You don't want to have it across the room. If you're going to be in bed, have it where you can get quick reach, where it's not obviously sitting out where someone can see it, and get close by.
So whoever was arguing, whoever's not Malcolm, sorry, I forget your name. So David, yeah, sorry. So you were saying that if you wanted to ban something, you would ban violent video games. Now,
at least do some kind of restriction on it, yeah.
Yeah. So are you aware that a recent study from the University of Texas said that actually for every 10% increase of violent video games, there was a 1% decrease in crime rates?
I didn't know that. No. I do know that the Columbine killers were obsessed with video games, violent video games, and various others that just were recent too, so who knows.
Malcolm, did you joined it there?
No.
Okay, another question.
You made a point about how gun control was to help tyranny and government, like in silencing their citizens and whatnot. I'm curious how you think that argument holds up in modern day America, where we have drones and high technology, and guns are not really a threat to the government. You can't just go picketing outside with your gun and hope to change the laws. I can understand how that point may hold up back in, when we had slaves and when people didn't have high surveillance technology, but today I don't really see that making a difference.
Thank you. It's a great question. All right. And, with the militarization of the police, you've had all these people that trained to, kill folk working in, Iraq and Afghanistan. They've come back. They've gone into the police. You see the way these police are dressed now. They look like military. You're absolutely correct. I mean, and I'm certainly not suggesting that, we go with our, 40 caliber, guns and we go up against the police and the military. However, it is I think there is a big difference in having an armed and trained citizenry, people who know how to use weapons. it acts as a disincentive. A disincentive for what? Well, first of all, a disincentive to take firearms. No policeman wants to go into somebody's house searching for somebody's armed. It's the most dangerous exercise possible. It encourages the government to respect people's rights. The fact that we would probably, you'd probably lose out. Now, it is true in Afghanistan, they have shown that, asymmetric force, you can hold down a major power like the Soviet Union, even the United States for a while, with I'm sorry.
1 minute left.
Yeah, so you can hold them down with asymmetric, but I'm not talking about guns in order to defeat the government in an all-out war. That is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it acts as a disincentive, and you can't go about abusing citizens and trampling over their rights when you know that they are armed. There is a difference. You can, if they're helpless and they don't have arms and there's no possibility of them shooting back, you can do whatever you want. Does that answer your question?
Anyone on this side have a question? Yes?
So, going to this point that was just being discussed, Dave, I believe I heard you say you were complaining about someone adding to a quote of George Washington's, where he had talked about the right to keep and bear arms, and they had added something about, in defense against government, and you said that was incorrect, and nobody was even talking about that at that time, that wasn't something that was under discussion. I pulled up on the web, I've got actually there's a whole long list of quotes here from the Founding Fathers. Many of them do address that specific point. For example, Noah Webster said in an examination of the leading principles of the federal Constitution on October 10th, 1787, "Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops." So perhaps you'd like to address that. And regarding the asymmetrical warfare, it is clearly the case that armed bands of guerrillas are very effective in controlling parts of the world, just using no more than small arms. So I think it does clearly present a deterrent to government exercising complete control and tyranny over our people.
If I might respond, I was referring to the specific quote by George Washington, where you'll find on the internet that quote with the added phrase, quite blatant change to the historical record, but you can actually look up the actual statement. So yes, you'll find all kinds of stuff on the web where people have taken some statements and added to it. I think we're out of time now.
Malcolm, did you want to get a response in?
Well,
Can I?
What's that? Time's up?
Out of time.
What'd you say?
Yeah, it's at almost 12 minutes.
Oh, okay. Malcolm, do you want to do your final statement? You have 5
Sure.
minutes.
Okay. There are over 300 million guns in the United States, more than one gun for every man, woman and child. What could gun control possibly mean at this point? In a perfect world, gun control would mean going house to house throughout the nation and taking people's guns away. Well, we know that's impossible. Regardless of the constitutionality, people would either fight back or hide their guns and claim they have none. Most guns in the United States are unregistered, so we don't have a register of where the guns are. So actually, debating gun control is almost a futile exercise. Yes, criminals will be able to find a gun close to them, Dave. Even the lowest estimates show that 30% of US households own at least one firearm, making it very easy for a criminal who can't get it under his own aegis to actually borrow it from a friend or a family member who does have one. use an anonymous browser like Tor, go onto the darknet, and you can buy anything you want. Illegal drugs, firearms, send some Bitcoin, and they'll send it to you by a registered envelope. Nowadays, you can even rent guns, and this is what they found in the UK. You can even rent guns on the internet. Gangs rent guns for single jobs. In fact, why it got into the newspapers was they found two gangs fighting each other, and they both rented the same gun at different points to fight each other. My God, you can even print a gun on a 3D printer now, and it's a usable gun. Now, it wouldn't be too effective, but things are changing quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, it's too late for gun control. The cat is well and truly out of the bag. Now, the solution. There is a common sense approach to this subject, and of course it's being completely ignored. And that solution is ending the drug war. Mass shootings get all the media attention, but the drug war kills far more people. If gun control advocates really want to prevent more homicides, it's not background checks that will get us there, it's the legalization of drugs. Illicit drug proceeds are the lifeblood of gang behavior, and competition over market turf is the primary driver of gun violence. There are more than 2,000 homicides a year are gang-related, as opposed to 20 to 40 people killed from mass shootings. Illegal American sales of marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine amount to something like $100 billion. That's $100 billion changing hands without access to any of the official legal mechanisms for protecting commerce or peacefully resolving disputes. Under such circumstances, violence is inevitable. When distributors can't rely on the courts or on law to settle disputes and to deliver product, they take matters into their own hands. End the drug war, on the other hand, and you take a $100 billion industry that currently depends on criminal violence and you bring it into the peaceful marketplace. As to terrorism, we forget the role that Western policies have played in creating the conditions from which groups like ISIS have emerged. Much of the ruling elite of ISIS was recruited in the vacuum as a result of the US government dismantling the state of Iraq, and similarly, Western policy of promoting regime change in Syria led to the strengthening of ISIS, and toppling Gaddafi in Libya has created this zone of anarchy from which jihadists can operate freely, and hundreds of thousands of immigrants are passing into Europe just this summer. Our foreign policy has been a complete disaster. Changing it will be one giant step to reducing terrorism in this country. Thank you.
Oh my, the causes. Yes, the causes are many of the situation we are in. But we are talking about real life here. We're talking about reality. Mike, please read the question.
Resolved, this House is opposed to gun control.
Thank you. That's an either or. The choice is not between varying degrees of gun control. The issue is any or none at all. That's exactly as it is worded. An I vote would mean the following things could and probably would happen. Number one, a convicted felon gets out on probation and is able to go down without anyone saying boo and purchase an AR-15 and to kill whoever he wants to kill. Scenario number two, an angry kid in school who's maybe 14 years old has every right to go down to the gun store, buy as many pistols as he wants, take them to school and shoot the other kids. No one can say boo. The third scenario, an ISIS, what do they call those guys? Jihadi soldiers? Ah, yes. Oh, now no restriction. They can go to the gun store and get 50 guns, and no one can say boo to them. They can go down and shoot and kill, and their insane religion tells them they're going to heaven for doing that. God have mercy on us. What a belief to have. No one can say boo to that. If you say aye, and this policy were to pass, that is exactly what would happen. Scenario number 4. Any civilian can purchase a Sidewinder Gatling gun, 3,000 rounds a minute. They use them in helicopter gunships to totally eradicate the opposition. Go up to the top of a skyscraper in Market Street on parade day and take out thousands of lives in a few minutes. That's what an aye vote would mean. It means no ID, no picture ID, no background checks, no registration. You are at total liberty to get whatever you want, do whatever you want with it, and no one can say boo. Is that what you want? That is what an aye vote would mean tonight. For the sake of sanity and common sense, I appeal to you to vote nay. Thank you.